How's it going? So far, so good? So far, so good?
Yeah, I really enjoy this up here at the party, and very welcome change of pace. Are you going to be over the Neiman?
Oh yes, I'm the Neiman tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm going to Bill College invite me over.
Oh yeah, Neiman, you're doing the Neiman? I'm going to be there at 4 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes.
Oh good. I guarantee.
Well, I think we're going out to dinner with
Yes.
Lynn
Yes.
afterwards.
Good.
Sasser's going to pay.
I think
Yeah,
let
I'll
Coverage
do
do
that.
it. Let Coverage do it.
I still got some of the leftover campaign money. Yeah.
Yes, real Beijing duck. Well, you like this event tomorrow. It's pretty tame.
I hear your film is very good.
Well, it's about our accursed trade. So you.
Hi, could I have your attention, please? Hi, my name is Bert Huang. I'm the chair of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Thank you for coming. We're all delighted that you came for this event and also for the study groups open house we just had. If you find these study groups very interesting, as I think a lot of you will, you can continue to sign up for the study groups through next week here at the IOP. I also want to thank you for sticking around for one of our very special events every year. This is the first time that we are officially introducing our spring fellows for the spring semester of 1995. They are very special people to us, as all fellows are, because of the willingness to take time and spend it with the students and the community, and to help us accomplish our mission here at the IOP, which is bringing together the worlds of academia and politics. So I'm going to turn it over to Martin Nolan, a former fellow and now political writer for the Boston Globe. Mr. Nolan.
Hi. Well, good evening. On our stage today are several people who've been deeply involved in politics, including several as actual candidates, and now are in private life. A great Tennessean, Senator Sasser, James Knox Polk, was President of the United States, and he put in his diary about 2 days before he had to leave office after his term. He said, I look forward to Wednesday when he would leave. He said, a servant no more, a sovereign again at last. Unfortunately for Polk, he only lived a few months after that, so that was before they had the Institute of Politics here, and where he could come here as a fellow. I'm going to start with Chris Hennick, who's at the end. He is Executive Director of the Republican Governors Association. He's conducted campaigns in 12 southern states, and worked with the late Lee Atwater, and has had a lot of successes in the late Confederacy on behalf of the Republicans. He attended Ole Miss and graduated from Georgetown. Chris Hennick.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. And in fact, this, coming from Washington, this setting kind of reminds me of the McLaughlin group, so maybe minus all the staged acrimony here this evening. But I do want to thank the Student Advisory Committee for obviously waiving their veto privilege and giving me the opportunity to be a fellow here. I'm going to hold up all the obligations and hopefully be worthy of, accordingly, of all the tributes that we'll get throughout this spring. It's interesting to note, I've been through orientation here this past week, and it's been real interesting, dinners and suppers, but it reminds me of a job that I received a few years ago following managing a successful congressional campaign in North Carolina. I ended up, as a booby prize, ended up becoming the Southern Regional Political Director for the Republican National Committee. And Washington has a fixation on titles, and it's a mouthful in itself. So we went through a whole week of orientation and understanding polls, and my very first trip was to go down to Columbia, South Carolina, and meet the governor and the party leaders of the state. A new job, a new briefcase, and I get right off the airplane and went into a hangout, which is not unusual. All state capitals have these hangouts where all these legislators gather. I'm sure Beacon Hill has one here. I just haven't been to that one yet. But I went right into this place with the director of the state party. He pointed out a table where some good old boy legislators were having their barbecue. I went right up to him, extended my hand, and said, hello, I'm the new RPD from the RNC. And without batting an eye, this old legislator looked up with a mouthful of barbecue and retorted his own acronym, E-I-E-I-O. I can assure you I won't be calling home saying I'm a JFK fellow in IOP or some other type of title, but I'm different from everyone else here at this panel. I have never placed my name on a ballot, nor do I intend to. I also have never had to have the pressure of filing a political story by 6 p.m. So I am different. I come to politics and have been driven toward it, not by any cause or by any movement or by any single issue. That may sound horrors to people, but I'm driven to it because of the game. I've always wanted to be a political operative. It's been interesting to know, just to see across the South, Senator, no disrespect, but from where I'm from, and most southern states, Mississippi and a number of other southern states were one-party state. To be for change, reform, to be anti-establishment was to be a Republican. And I had an opportunity before working in politics. In essence, I was aimless. I had no purpose. And politics gave me an opportunity to test myself. I tested my oversoul. I delved right into political nonfiction like I've never done before in my life. I had the opportunity to meet Haley Barber from my own hometown. I'd known his family for years, but he was about 9 or 10 years older than I was. And personally, I was real intrigued with the Southern strategist. Lee Atwater blew through town, and that was the political equivalent to Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus for me. Charlie Black from North Carolina. I had all the opportunities to meet operatives. I wasn't intrigued with candidates as much as I was with meeting with campaign people. And I sense, and I know all the people here on this table know, that working in politics, the real rewards in this business is to have done it. And I've just done it with some of the most innovative Republican leaders of this country, with Republican governors. And I've left my job parochially in the South, and I've learned the country through these governors and their political campaigns. And it's given me the experience that you could never imagine. Personally, my greatest concern in politics is there's a great void of talent in political campaigns. They are extremely interesting, they're exciting, but they're also tentative. They're like Brigadoon. They're here one moment, they're gone the next. But what's the most important factor of it is the political implications of election results. If you look at 1991, Harris-Wofford special election, that set the whole stage for the health care debate. 1993, Christie Whitman's victory in New Jersey. If you could imagine Jim Florio would have been reelected in New Jersey, you would have had every excuse in the world for politicians to go off and raise taxes. In turn, now tax cuts are in vogue, plus they were. Also in Virginia, Governor George Allen, his victory helped set the stage for criminal reform, jury's right to know, truths in sentencing, abolishing parole. I believe Senator of the Senate acted in less than 24 hours after his victory on a crime package that I don't believe they've acted on in a long, long time prior to that victory. So the implications of campaigns and elections can be very, very important. My purpose here is to hopefully get you involved in politics if you have never tried it before. The future is for you, 1996, 1998, 2000, 2002. You have a great, great opportunity. My courses, I will not bring any cause celebs. I'm intentionally bringing in practitioners, managers, pollsters. We've been so busy since the election, I haven't even analyzed polls that I've paid for already. So I'm going to learn with you. We're going to go back through and look objectively at the 1994 elections and try to understand certainly the politics behind the Republican Revolution. So I look forward for my spring here and learning from you as well, too.
Thanks, Chris. Sharon Pratt Kelly, thank you. Our next speaker knows something about power, that is at least electrical power. As we who lived in the district knew her when she was an important personage for the Potomac Electric Power Company, the only really reliable power in Washington most of the time, certainly more reliable than either end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Sharon Pratt Kelly was the first female mayor of the District of Columbia. She's been involved as a Democratic committeewoman from Washington for 4 terms, and she received the Mary McLeod Bethune W.E. Du Bois Award, highest Black Achievement Award. And she is a graduate of both undergraduate and the law school of Howard University. Mayor Sharon Pratt Kelly.
Delighted. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I am excited about being here at the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. It's quite a difference to have come from a world where every day and every moment and every hour was predetermined and scheduled, to now having the freedom to set my own agenda and essentially establish my own schedule. Now, there's one downside to it, of course. In the other world, they had 2 or 3 people who did my schedule. Now I'm doing it for myself, and I placed it in the wizard that I was to be here tonight for dinner. I forgot to place in the wizard that I was being served for dinner, and so I'm dressed for the weather and not for this stage. But I tried to think about how I could share with you honestly and not have one of these sort of programmed discussions of how it was I got involved in politics. And the truth is, I'm at a loss to explain it to you. I grew up in a city that is at the center of politics and power, Washington, D.C. I'm a 3rd-generation Washingtonian. There are some of us who are actually born there. And you can generally tell those of us that are, we're the ones with the Southern accent. And yet, in the environment of Washington, you were not allowed to be involved in politics. It is the home of the civil servant. And indeed, it was not until 1962 that anyone could even vote for president in Washington, D.C. And it wasn't until 1975 that you even had a limited, and that's all that exists today, a limited form of home rule. And yet, somehow or another, my father always talked about policy issues, and I always knew that I wanted to be involved as a citizen in the issues of our country and in the issues of our community. When I was a student at Howard University, quite naturally I was interested in the topic of the District of Columbia being fully enfranchised. And throughout my adult career, I got involved like Chris, supporting candidates. I got involved by becoming actively involved with the Democratic National Committee. I, too, used the acronym once with a senator. I said the DNC. He thought I was talking about a female operation, but nonetheless. But I myself thought that I would never actually get involved in the fray and actually stand for office. And then in the close to 1990, it was the latter part of the 1980s, I decided to get involved myself. And the reason I got involved is very basic, and it's my perception of what politics means. To me, it is what we each have an obligation to do, that we as citizens have an obligation to be involved. And I just did not want to be a person who stood on the sidelines and talked about, well, it ought to be this way and it ought to be that way. I just do not like those kind of armchair pundits. I said, I'm going to get up and get involved, and if the worst happens, at least I can force some discussion and debate about the direction of our community, because it seemed to me that we had to do something about the problems that we were facing in our communities, the problems of violence, the problems of families in crisis. Every strata of society is having a problem with families in crisis. That we are a nation that takes pride in the fact that we're a country that bask in the glory that we have every bit of the planet right here in this country, and yet somehow we have never been at peace with our own diversity and harnessing that as a strength. That here we are, a nation that is about to cross the threshold of the 21st century, and we've done nothing to re-examine education. We do nothing to prepare our employees or the citizens to be really equipped to be a part of the workforce of the 21st century. That there are a lot of critical issues that require some people to get involved and do something about it. Well, actually, I got involved. I had no support. I had no money. None of the pundits, none of the players thought I was a significant force. And yet I wanted to push forward on that agenda and that message that we could affect change. We got a lot of young people involved. And the beauty of that election in 1990, when we surprised everybody in that town, as it were, was that it was a powerful message to a lot of folks that if you put your heart and soul in it, and you have the resolve to make a difference, and you don't get caught up in Monday night quarterbacking each and every day, things can happen. And individuals such as myself and those of you can make us move forward. The last 4 years has been an incredible challenge to that idealism about what politics is about. An incredible assault on my own views about how you can make a difference. But I know from the experience of the last 4 years that by staying with it, and though we live in a time where there is a fair amount of cynicism, that I'm just as optimistic and full of hope about our communities as was I when I first stood office. It seems like eternity 4 years ago. I must say, as a result of that experience, come out of it a lot more conservative on a lot of issues than was I before. Because I do think it's important that we somehow challenge all of us to become involved as individuals and not look to government to solve every last one of our problems. And what I hope to do through my seminar is to talk about how we prepare our cities for the next century, and to somehow, through you, continue to rekindle that idealism and that spirit of what this school and this institute is about, and that is that politics is the business of every citizen.
Thank you. Our next speaker, our next fellow, is from Indiana, and we expect her to be the most notable import from Hoosier land hereabouts since Larry Bird. She has many accomplishments, BS from Valparaiso University and an MBA and a PhD from Indiana University. She ran for the Senate in 1986 and was elected to the House in 1988, and she worked in the Congressional Rural Caucus, received an award from the American Public Welfare Association for her work in the food stamp program, and her subject of her study group is big: American agriculture in the next millennium. Welcome, Jill Long.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel very, very privileged to be here, and this isn't where I planned to be in February of 1995. I was expecting to go back to the United States House of Representatives, but I do feel very privileged to be here. And when I came up for the interview, in fact, was really impressed with the intensity of the students that I met with and their commitment to policy and working to make this country stronger. And I was reminded a little bit of how things were when I first started college and how I progressed to become politically active. I always, I think, surprise people when I tell them not only did I not intend to go into politics, and certainly not to the extent that I have growing up, but I had very, very different career plans. I'm 42 years old. I graduated from high school in 1970. And when I graduated from high school, my intent was to be a professional baton twirler. That's probably, the motivation for that is probably not what you might expect it to be, but in 1970, when I graduated from high school, we had virtually no varsity sports for girls or for women at my high school, and I liked to compete. And the one thing that I could compete in was competitive baton twirling, and came very close to winning a state championship, in fact, in Indiana. I'm not telling you that so that you'll ask me to twirl for you, but to make the point that those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s and were competitive, those of us girls, now women, we didn't have the same kinds of opportunities that exist for women today. We still have a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress since those days. I come from a family that was politically active at the local level. My dad was a Democratic precinct committeeman, and my first recollection of being active in politics was coming home from school in 1958 at age 6. We had a turquoise and white Chevy that I thought was really pretty. Had these sort of rounded fin things on the back, and my mom and I would get in the car after school. I grew up on a farm in rural Indiana. And my brother would go out and help my dad milk the cows, and my mom and I would get in the car and go register voters so that we could work to get people involved in the political process. And in that fall, we were working particularly hard for our neighbor, who was also a farmer, who was running for the county sheriff's office and ultimately won that seat and was very active in politics for a number of years. My dad was held a local office, the local township advisory board. So I grew up in a family where we were always involved in the community, but it just was not my intent to do much in the way of running for office, because women didn't do that in those days. I went to college, got my bachelor's degree, went down to Indiana University and started a master's program, and then got accepted into a doctoral program. And it was in the late 1970s that I made a conscious decision to get politically active. I was in my mid-20s, and I was listening more closely to what some of the politicians were saying about our economy at that time. We had double-digit inflation, we were in a recessionary period, and I began to realize that what some of them were saying wasn't consistent with what I had been learning in my courses, and decided that maybe I had something to offer to the political process. And decided then and there that I would take a teaching position where I might be able to run for office and take it from there. So that's what I did. I ran for a local city council seat that by everybody's projections I should not have won, but I won the city council seat and decided it wasn't too difficult. So then I decided to run for the United States Congress. And in the course of running for the Congress, for the House of Representatives, our Senate candidate back in 1986 in Indiana became ill and dropped out of the race. And so I thought, well, city council's not too hard. Running for the House hasn't been too difficult. I think I'll run for the United States Senate against Dan Quayle, who had, I think at the time I got into the race in January, close to $2 million in his political coffers, and I had maybe $1,000 in mine. But I decided to run for that seat and got the endorsement of the state party. And there were a lot of commitments that were made to me as I was endorsed to run, many commitments which were never kept. There were commitments to raise money, for example. I ended up raising $125,000 in that entire campaign, and after a couple of months realized that I was not going to be able to run the kind of campaign that you would normally do in a statewide Senate race. And so I made a determination that with the limited resources that I had, I would do the very best that I could. And I hired my cousin's 20-year-old daughter, rented a small American-made car, and just started driving everywhere I could in Indiana. I had a plan. One week I would go clockwise around the state, and the next week I would go counterclockwise around the state. And what I couldn't do by buying media time on television, I did by talking to voters. And I stood up in town squares all over the state of Indiana, did old-fashioned politicking, and got about 40% of the vote when nobody thought I could even get 30% of the vote. From there, I decided that maybe I could do it if I could just raise the money. Ran for Congress in 1988, lost, but Dan Quayle won the vice presidency, so he left his Senate seat to go to the vice president's office. Our congressman took his Senate seat, and we had a special election in 1989, and that's how I got to the United States House of Representatives. But it was a squeaker. I actually barely made it. And there's somebody here, Diane Tausner, I don't know if you know her, who actually worked on that campaign. We worked around the clock about 24 hours a day for about 8 weeks in a very short campaign period. But what I wanted to do in terms of public service, I have been able to do the last 6 years. I learned a lot of things about politics. Chris is very interested in the politics. I'm very interested in policy, and I think that we can do a better job than we've done in the past. I think that the only way we can do that, however, is to involve as many people as we can in the political process and make sure that people are informed. I think my time is probably running out. Let me just say what I think is very important for those of you who are here and who are involved. I have found in the short time that I've been on this campus that there are students here who are much more intense about the political process and being involved than is characteristic of the rest of our population. I think that it's not only important for you to stay involved, but to do what you can as you're preparing for your careers in politics or whatever, to get as many people across the country as involved. The research shows over and over again that the more people we involve in decision making, the better the decisions are. It takes longer to make the decisions, but they're better quality decisions. And if there's something that I think this country needs, it is the leadership of people like yourselves, not just working to make decisions, but to get more people brought into the decision-making process. And I would hope that over the course of this semester, I would have the opportunity to meet with a number of you, not just in the study groups, but individually. My study group is going to focus on agriculture and its relationship to our international trade, our overall economy, what rural communities and urban communities have to work toward together. The amount of money that we spend on farm subsidies is a very, very small percentage of the total federal budget, less than 1%, yet it's an area that's often targeted and criticized. But if we're going to make good policy decisions, we have to make those decisions based on accurate information. And so in our study group, I hope many of you will come. What I would like to do is to have us focus on the policy that we currently have in place, how much we spend, what it does, where we need to go from here. And thank you very much for this opportunity tonight.
Every group of fellows needs someone who has some experience in the media.
To beat up on it.
What they used to call at Harvard an ink-stained wretch, I think. Not so long ago, actually. I'm happy to introduce a fellow I've known a long time, at least since he worked for what we used to call U.S. News and World Report, and which he enlivened with his reports. But he worked at the Dallas Morning News, and he covered Lyndon Johnson, Sam Rayburn. He worked for the Atlanta Constitution, and happy to say he's worked at the Boston Globe for a long while, and graduated from the University of Minnesota. Double major in journalism and political science. Scotty Reston, who used to be the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, used to say about our business, he said, you get more through trust than through tricks. Now think of that. I mean, we always in the age of gotcha journalism. Well, our man here was on 3 different panels for presidential debates. And believe me, I know this, that either side can veto you, you know. So if both sides say you're okay, it's a good sign that you've got where you are with trust rather than tricks. John Mashik.
Thank you. Thanks, Marty. Like the other fellows, I'm certainly privileged to be here with you. I couldn't help but overhear Jim Sasser laugh in the background as Jill was explaining some commitments that were made to her that weren't kept. I'm sure many of them had that experience in this last campaign. I came to political journalism in a very roundabout, circuitous way as an undergraduate before any of you were born at the University of Minnesota. In the apathetic early 50s, I was either going to be the best sports announcer in the country or the best sports writer. And when I made the big decision through my advisor that, well, I was going to leave and do straight news, he said, well, thank God, because sports writers never grow up. And my oldest son is a sports writer, so I think he would take umbrage at that, but nevertheless, here I am. And I've been in Washington, as Marty indicated, off and on for a few spells, but almost a total of 30 years. My first year there was noteworthy because I attended, as one of my first assignments for the Dallas News, Dwight Eisenhower's last press conference. It was not televised. There were no tape recorders. And I remember being in the presence of the World War II hero who was about to leave office, or he was going in a few months, and hearing these words come out, and I said, boy, this is a great story. I can hardly wait to get back to my office. But when you get back, you had to wait for the official transcript. And the transcript came, and it was the most garbled syntax you ever saw. I mean, try to make a story out of anything Dwight Eisenhower said, and it was very difficult. But then Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were elected, and a lot of young people came to Washington. I can say this for the audience, that made a big change with journalists, with politicians. a change that I think is felt to this day. But with Lyndon Johnson, as Marty said, I covered him. Lyndon had a volcanic temper, and he particularly didn't like nosy reporters like myself. One of the first stories I did up there when he was a still majority leader was how he and Ralph Yarborough, the other Texas senator, were feuding. And the story, I suppose, did have something of a pro-Yarborough cast. But I did talk to Senator Albert Gore Sr. about it, and he happened to be a friend of Yarborough's. Well, the next day I was summoned into the office of the great man, who stood up in all 5 of him over me and said, "You're kind of new around here, aren't you, boy?" And I said, "Yes, Senator, I am." And he said, "Well, I noticed y'all didn't talk to me about this story when you wrote it." And I said, "No, sir, I wasn't able to get to you." He said, "Well, the next time, talk to me instead of that horses behind Al Gore." He didn't use the word behind, and there were a few other expletives in there, too. I really think that the main reason that I am here, and I told Terry Donovan this when I came up for my interview, there was a disturbing story in the Washington Post last month that not many people probably thought was disturbing besides me. A political bug bites fewer college freshmen. Annual survey of incoming students shows lowest interest in 29 years. And this wasn't just a little random poll of 1,000 people. It was almost 250,000 incoming freshmen. Now, I am sure that that wouldn't apply at Harvard, but I have been around college campuses a lot and like to speak to students either in journalism and government, and I must tell you, in the last few years, I find that to be just about right. People really not interested, turned off for various reasons. And that, after all, you out there are going to be the leaders that journalists of tomorrow are going to be covering. And if we have a smaller and smaller pool, that doesn't say much for what we're going to have in the governance in our cities, states, and at the federal level. Naturally, my study group is going to center on presidential politics, and if you think the race hasn't started yet, don't talk to Phil Graham or Lamar Alexander, who are probably out raising money tonight at some $1,000 a plate dinner in Timbuktu or New York City. It's going to be, like all races, probably different than the previous 4 years or the previous 4. And how the media covers it is also going to be probably different. We in the media, and I say media, that's television, that's press, that's talk radio now, it's cable television. Our popularity rate is just there with used car salesmen. Some of that earned, some of it unearned. But I hope to bring up here some outstanding journalists that you can ask questions of and you can tee off on and they can defend themselves. People who've run for office and felt the glories of winning in the agony of defeat like Paul Tsongas. And you can talk to them and hear it firsthand. So again, I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting us.
Our next fellow was elected to the United States Senate in 1976. He was involved in many, many issues of involving healthcare, education, but he's probably best known for us for serving so long in a really thankless task, I think, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And he's been in the news lately. I saw his picture on television as Clinton's choice to go to Beijing, but that's what I saw on television anyway. But I don't believe what I see on television. So, and he earned a bachelor's degree and a law degree from Vanderbilt University. Senator Jim Sasser.
Well, thank you very much, Marty, for that introduction. And listening to Marty give that introduction, I was reminded of an introduction made by another newspaper man in my state, Marty, a few years ago. Politicians prepare these long biographical sketches, and they hope that introducers will use those when they introduce them. So I was to be introduced by the publisher of the Nashville morning newspaper, the managing editor, really. So he pulled out this long biographical sketch and he said, "Do you want me to read all of this?" So, wanting to appear modest, I said, "Oh, no, John, don't pay any attention to any of that, just make it brief." So he got up and introduced me this way. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Jim Sasser, and the less said about him, the better." So, Marty, I'm very grateful for your introduction here this evening. Now, how did I get involved in politics? You know, I've reflected on that quite a lot, and I think it really goes back to my childhood. I grew up in the post-World War II South, in the immediate post-World War II years. That dates me. But when you got outside of many of the major cities in the South of that period, now remember this was the days before air conditioning, the day before anybody had ever heard of the term Sun Belt. When you got outside of the cities, many areas of the South were what we would characterize today, I think, as third world in their economic development. And I was in one of these rural communities as a child. It was segregated by race, and I saw great injustices I perceived as a child, great economic inequities. I well remember returning to school as a third grader after my sister and I had a lovely Christmas. And the teacher went around the room and asked the children what they'd gotten for Christmas. And a couple of children said, "Well, we got a crate of oranges." Families of 6 or 7 children. And I never forgot those things. So as I grew up and went through college, I became interested in political philosophy and government, because it appeared to me, and remembering my studies and remembering what I'd been told, it was government, for example, that brought the Tennessee Valley Authority to our area. And that brought electricity. And that brought jobs. And that brought industry. And that brought a better life to people who really had been struggling for generations after the end of the Civil War, which, of course, my section of the country and Chris's section lost. So it was a struggle, really, to try to find some means of rough economic equality, and some way to find a means of justice. And government appeared to offer the best opportunity to do that. So I started hanging around some politicians. And by the time I'd gotten to law school, I was hanging around an old Tennessee senator by the name of Estes Kefauver. Now, most of you won't remember old Estes, but he was on the ticket in 1956 as a Democratic nominee for vice president. And guess who he defeated in his race for the vice presidency at the Democratic National Convention? Right, John Fitzgerald Kennedy of Massachusetts. Well, Estes would come to town, and those were the days before senators having staffs, and I'd borrow my dad's car and meet him at the airport and drive him around and carry his bags, and he had a profound impact on me. And I thought, here's a guy who really cared. I'll never forget, he always carried a volume of Victor Hugo in his bag with him. And at night, he would read Victor Hugo. And I'd say, "Well, Senator, why are you reading that?" He'd say, "Well, you know, when you go to Washington and you forget how really grim life can be for other people. So I read this occasionally to remind myself." Well, I forgot about politics for a while, got married, started having a child, was practicing law, and then I started reading and thinking about the war in Vietnam. And it appeared to me that anyone with a cursory knowledge of history and of the French experience in Vietnam ought to know that we were embarking on a disaster. And it was going to be a disaster paid for by the lives of young men and some young women who were involuntarily pressed into the Army. They were drafted. Most of them weren't volunteers. The Marine Corps were volunteers, but most of the Army were draftees. So we lost tens of thousands of young people there, and that really activated me even more politically. So I got a call in 1970 from that old horses behind Senator Albert Gore Sr., John, and he'd been active in and a man I admire greatly, one of the great senators, I think, of all time, and he called me. Am I running over my time?
No, that's,
and he called me and he said, now, Jim, how about helping me run my campaign? And I said, I don't know how to do that. But we got involved in it and did a good job, and then I was off to the races. I was bitten by the political bug, and I became chairman of the Democratic Party in my state. Finally, I found that being chairman was ruining my law practice because I spent all the time politicking. So I said, I'm either going to be a full-time politician or a full-time lawyer, and I'm going to get it out of my system. And the only office I wanted to serve in was that of United States Senate. So I ran for the Senate. Nobody thought I could win, but I defeated the incumbent, a guy named Bill Brock, a well-entrenched, well-financed incumbent, and went on to serve in the Senate. I had the great good fortune to arrive at the Senate just at the time a generation was kind of changing. The Senate moves in generations. And I walked into my first Democratic caucus, and there was Hubert Humphrey, Ed Muskie, Scoop Jackson, all the great luminaries of the Democratic Party in the 60s and 70s. And I thought, what in the world am I doing here? I shared that sentiment with an old senator I came to like a lot, wasn't prepared to like. When I got there, Jim Eastland of Mississippi, a crusty old fellow. And Senator Eastland said, well, son, says, you'll get over that. In 6 months, you'll know why you're here. You wonder how in the hell all the rest of you got here. Well, in any case, I'm going on too long, but in our study group, we're going to look at the Democratic Party. We're going to analyze the elections of '94, what happened. I'm not sure it was a revolution, Chris. We'll look into that and see. We're going to talk about the Clinton presidency and where it's going. What are his chances of getting reelected? Where's the country going in the long term over the next 10 or 15 years politically? We'll have pollsters, we'll have media people, we'll have other practicing politicians, and even old former has-been politicians like myself there. So thank you very much for letting me filibuster over my time, Marty. I expect I did.
Yeah, we don't invoke cloture when you're telling good stories about guys like Kefauver and so forth. Our next fellow did not come here innocent of the way this place works, because he actually has a degree from the Kennedy School. And after getting that degree in '84, he's been deeply involved in Republican politics and worked for people like Connie Mack and Lynn Martin, former Secretary of Labor, who was on this platform not too many semesters ago. And he ran for Congress in Michigan and didn't come out the way he wanted, but we got him here. John Shaw.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you. As a Republican, I was thinking, as you see us arrayed here before you this evening, this is about the only time in my life I will be to the left of Jim Sasser. But I think I'm here because having run for Congress, I have the unique distinction of being about the only Republican this year who didn't manage to get elected to the United States Senate. But I think that's the quirkiness of this year, that somehow this year politics is really like quantum physics. You know, the political molecules are in a highly agitated state. And we're living through, in some ways, if you will, the charms and the quirks of the system. But I'm not supposed to talk about physics. I'm supposed to talk about politics. And I'm happy to do so because 11 years ago, I was sitting in that chair and not in this chair. I was an MPP student at the Kennedy School. took an IOP study group, I remember doing it, and went on from this place. Unlike my fellow Republican way over on that side, I was not a party operative, and Chris is one of the best in the business, but I was just the opposite. I was one of those policy wonks. And I came out of the Kennedy School, went to my first job at the White House Office of Management and Budget, and yes, I was one of those despised beings, you know, those bureaucrats. I was a civil servant. In fact, having spent more than 3 years, I'm a tenured career civil servant. Fairly unusual for someone who ran for Congress. You think, having been a Kennedy School student and done that, I would have known better, but I didn't, and I made the leap to the political side. So I sort of did it in the theoretical and the practical, and sort of did both. And at age 28, found myself in the Bush White House doing domestic policy. From there, went on to be chief of staff for the Department of Labor. What an experience to be a part of that decision-making process. And I'm just going to tell you one White House story, because you always wonder, how do decisions ultimately get made in the White House? And I remember one day back in 1989, relatively small group, about a dozen of us, meeting with the president on welfare reform. I remember because we were talking about how now, in 1989, to shift some of the welfare reform responsibility to the states so they could take over and do experiments and do what was right. In 1989, we're talking about what we're doing here in 1995. I remember because Dick Darman had just said, actually under President Nixon, when he was part of it, they had proposed legislation in 1971. Talk about reinventing government. Just goes to show there really isn't anything new under the political sun. But we had done this marathon session with the president. And by the end of it, there was only one more decision to be made. Part of my job was to be the guy to capture the decisions as they were coming out of the president's mouth and taking all this down for posterity. So my nose is sort of to the paper, and I'm scribbling away. And all of a sudden, I hear the cabinet members begin to giggle. Well, cabinet members are often verbose. They are frequently boring, but they rarely giggle. And I thought, what in the world? So I looked up. And there, George Bush had brought out from the Oval Office, so there in the middle of the cabinet room table, this big crystal ball. He stood up in front of it and said, well, crystal ball, should I go with option number 2 on the remaining question? Passed his hands over the crystal ball. A voice from the crystal ball says, absolutely. George Bush says, there you have it, that's my decision, you're all dismissed. Someday I'm going to have to go to the Bush Library and see how I wrote that down for posterity. It struck me as far more a Ronald Reagan thing to do than George Bush. But there you have it. I have since wondered, watching Bill Clinton, if George Bush hadn't left that crystal ball behind. But anyway, these are wonderful times too. And that's why I'm going to put in a plug for my work, my study group, on the contract with America. Because these 100 days are revolutionary in some ways. And everybody sort of wonders, what is that thing that Newt Gingrich always brings out of his pocket every time he's on national television? Well, it's this thing. And we're going to look at it week by week. It just so happens that the 100 days of the contract with America correspond exactly to the time period of this study group. So that's how we're going to do it. It also made me realize how much can be accomplished in 100 days. A very short period of time, if you think about it. I realize I've now been alive about 12,000 days. So 100 is small. And I look back to August to November of last year, where within just 100 days, Michigan has a late primary. I both won an election and lost an election. Very narrowly won a primary, very narrowly lost a general. And I learned it's very hard to win, and it's very hard to lose. And I'm glad to be here to give some of the give and take on both of those contingencies. And I'm just delighted to be able to spend the next 100-day chunk of my life here with all of you at the Institute of Politics. Thank you.
Our final fellow I saw on the McNeil-Lehrer report, I think last Friday, was it? Talking about Congress, the hot topic, which is a hot topic of her hot study group, I'm sure. She was in the Congress for a term and came from Salt Lake City, where we had another fellow here a few years ago, Ted Wilson. And she is a BA in English from the University of Utah. So you don't have to just study economics or political science. And a master's degree in British literature, which I think is fascinating. Karen Shepard from Utah.
Well, I can't help thinking while I'm sitting here of a transposition and what I would have been thinking if I were your age at the time that I lived, and how I would have projected my own future at that time. And I have to tell you that I never thought I would be a member of Congress. I never thought I would be in the Utah Senate. What I wanted more than anything was to get a master's in English literature, to teach it, possibly a PhD, to get married and have children. And that was basically my horizon. Now I'm 54 years old, and it is true that in 1957, when I graduated from high school, that careers for women were not anything that we knew about. I virtually knew of no woman in a career, period, at all. But I still had planned one for myself, although it was a career that was very appropriate for the time in which I was living. I have a fatal flaw and a great benefit, I think, and that is that I bore easily. And so it came to me after 5 years of teaching freshman English, after I hadn't gotten a PhD, and that's what happens to you if you don't get a PhD and you stay in college English departments, that I could never read another freshman English composition as long as I lived. And with all due apologies to all of the freshmen in this room, that's a heavy diet for a long time. And I started looking for open doors, and really the fact that I always went through the most interesting open door, and or the door that looked like it may have the most open doors behind it, is the fact that led me to politics. I've always been a Democrat. My family believed in public service. We talked politics over the table. We didn't talk party politics, we just talked solution politics. How do you solve these problems for a society? My father worked for the federal government. He couldn't be of a party. And I never knew until he retired in 1974 that he always considered himself a Democrat. So I came to it myself. My political philosophy has been shaped by three enormous experiences. One of them is that my husband, Vince Shepard, and I lived for 2 years in Cairo, Egypt. We taught at the American University in Cairo, and I lived for 2 years in a country, a glorious, rich country filled with history that had such political trauma and such economic disparity that the society was almost lost and is today. And I said to myself then, what we have in the United States of America with our middle class is the most important thing we could have in the world. It is the thing that gives us our strength, and we must never, never, never allow our society to get into a position where there are very few who are very wealthy and most who are very poor. And that has been a guiding beacon for me. I almost didn't have children because of the Vietnam War, Jim. I thought, how could I possibly bring children in the world that looks like we're going to be living in? And I was thinking not just of the war, but of the environment. I was thinking of what was happening to education at that time and what I thought the future for my children and their children would be. And so when I embarked on being a mother, I took it very seriously, and it is ultimately the other one of the major shaping experiences of my life. And there is no law that I have ever voted on that I didn't first say, what will this do to families and what will this do to children? Because those children are our future, not just mine, but yours and you and your grandchildren. They are the people that are going to keep this country together. And finally, I owned a business. That's another thing I didn't expect to do. It was another boredom wall I hit, and I ended up owning a publishing company, and this is a great thing to do in Utah if you're bored. I started a magazine for working women in Salt Lake City, Utah, And I wasn't bored at all for 10 years. I was very, very, very busy. And I was busy with the kind of socio-political part of that. But I was also very busy and intrigued with just the business part of that, with taking the responsibility for 12 families whose livelihoods depended on me making that payroll. It was absolutely a life-shaping experience, and it taught me that you have to balance the budget. It taught me that you can't go into debt very far. It taught me that you can't eat up your seed corn, because if you do, you won't be able to make your business grow. And all of those things are things that we should be applying to government. So when an open door came to me, and literally it was for me, an opportunity that they sought me to run for the state senate, I first said no, but I had been a community activist for a very long time, and it seemed like a wonderful way to make my opinions have some power. And I very much wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I ran for the state senate, and in 2 years, the congressional seat was an open seat. I didn't have to run against an incumbent. I ran for that seat, and miracle of miracles, I won in what is very much a Republican district. And I believe that I served in Congress in the most interesting 2 years in the history of Congress. It was an amazing time, just as these 2 years are an amazing time. I went there to reduce the deficit, and I went there to make the place work better, to work on reform, and was co-chair of the Democratic freshman reform effort. We managed to get some very strong bills through the House of Representatives. They were killed in the Senate, Jim, I hate to say it. I know you tried hard to save them, but they didn't make it through those last days. And many of these reforms that we worked on, not the two that I just referred to, but many of them were passed on the first day of this Congress. And I honestly believe that the 4 years of the 103rd and the 104th Congress are going to shape that institution for the next 100 years. And that the reforms that take place in this period of time and the process of doing those reforms is possibly the most important thing that's going on right now. But I can tell you it's not easy, and people in power do not like reformers at all. One of the most memorable experiences I had in this process was that about every 3.5 weeks we'd go in and see the speaker, and the first time I went in, there were only 2 of us, me and Eric Fingerhut, who was the other co-chair of the Democratic freshman reform effort. We were sort of a beleaguered, lonely couple, and we went in and made our case, and the speaker listened, and and he kind of, it'll pass. And we left. And then the next time we went back with more people, and then the next time we went back, we just got this train going. And when we had a moderate group of people once in there, and we were finally making some headway, and we really had him paying attention, and we knew that because he was mad at us. It came time to leave, and we started to go out the front door of his office, and he virtually leapt in front of us and said, "Oh, no, go out this way." So we went out the back door, and just in time to see what I not so affectionately refer to as the golf and tennis lobby going in to his office, the other door. We almost met each other face to face, and he had to confront each of us one after another. Such is the life of the speaker. We'll have Speaker Foley and Minority Leader Michael, I hope, coming to talk to you, and they can talk to you about some of the most interesting things that have happened in Congress in the last many years, and compare them to what are happening in these 2 years. I'm very grateful to be here. Losing elections is not easy, but this is making it a very great learning experience. Thank you.
We got time for a few questions. You have a couple of questions? Somebody has a question. Somebody have a question about all these people? Yes.
Here's a question.
Hi, I'm Dan Allen. I'm an undergraduate here at the college. Several of you mentioned that students my age, especially, have become less interested in politics than they were possibly when you guys were my age. I was wondering, well, a few things. This is open to all of you. Whether you think people are less interested now than they were, why that is, what can be done in addition to coming to your study groups, and really how that has affected the country.
Tall order. I'm going to turn it over. Go ahead,
I'll
Sharon.
take a stab at it. The reason that I care so much about reform is that I think people are become very cynical about politics, and I think it may be the greatest danger to our democracy. You're not interested in something that you don't think you can have an effect on, and I don't think people feel like they can have an effect on politics. I think they feel manipulated. I think and that's by both campaigns and the media, they feel. And I think that they believe that when they elect people, those people go and don't behave in the way that they would want them to behave. And so they, in essence, wash their hands of it. And that's why I think we must have reform.
So why is it that you think that people feel more cynical than they were, say, 20 years ago?
John?
Well, I would just take a slightly different cut at it. I ran for Congress in a district that has one of those large universities, the University of Michigan, because I ran in Ann Arbor. And certainly, the student involvement was less in November than it had been in previous years. But it seems to me that it's really sort of two different groups. There's always a core group of young people who care about politics and are involved in the process. And they're the same regardless. And then depending on sort of where you are historically, then there's sort of everybody else who's their avocation for that time. It's a hobby. And it's more, I think, a reflection of what's sort of happening in the world, whether young people are particularly interested at that moment. So I think we can read too much, in some sense, into less interest and more cynicism on the part of young people, because I'm not sure it breaks out that way. I think there are sort of more groups of young people than we're looking at as a whole.
Yeah, I've got an idea about it. I think there are really two reasons. One is there is a torrent of information that hits young people now and flows out to all of us that's increased in geometric proportions over the past few years. Now, I had a television political media person tell me, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but he said that the number of messages that the average person receives have doubled since 1988 and today. And these are messages coming from radio, television, newspapers, contacts with other people, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. There's more competing for the attention of the student or the young person. But secondly, and I think much more malignant, is the constant downgrading and the constant criticism and the constant focusing on sort of trivial conduct, in many cases, of elected officials in government and government. I mean, I don't know how long a democratic form of government can survive if the citizens are hit on a daily basis with a drumbeat of criticism or a drumbeat of what was called news, which says that those who are elected and are sent to serve the people are either corrupt, unresponsive, venal, ignorant, or just don't care. Now, there has been a sort of a quantum explosion of that in the last few years. I'll say this and be quiet, Marty. And it comes primarily, I think, from the electronic media, television primarily. And at first there was 60 Minutes. Now there's 2020. There's hard copy. Everybody has got some television program that focuses on a couple of congressmen going to play golf somewhere or something like that. Well, maybe they shouldn't do that. But it appears to me television ought to be telling people also that you're not going to cure the budget deficit by doing away with food stamps. I mean, if you ran a poll, I'll venture to say that a very large percentage of the American people think welfare and foreign aid make up 70% of the federal budget.
Let's get
So
There's another question here. Let's,
Hi, my name is David Yarkin, and I'm a senior at the college, and my question is for Senator Sasser. I don't know if you remember a very poignant moment for me in 1993 when Carol Moseley Braun stood up to Jesse Helms and defeated the United Daughters of the Confederacy Amendment. And then in a very, very, very poignant moment, Senator Heflin, the real bulwark of the South, went over to Moseley Braun and hugged her. And that, to me, I thought that was a real watershed event in Southern politics. And yet, a year after that, the South voted overwhelmingly for Republicans, and then Heflin's co-senator, Shelby, switched parties. I wonder if you could just comment on what you think the future of the Democratic Party is in the South and on that matter.
well, I think the Democratic Party is in for some tough days down south. And I think it was clear in the past elections. I mean, the Democratic losses were worse in the South than anywhere else. And I think Democrats in the Senate were lucky in that the only Senate seats up in the South were in the state of Tennessee. I have a hunch if there had been other Senate seats up in the South, we might have lost some other very good Democratic senators. Part of the problem in the South now, I think, is attributable, quite frankly, to the president. The president's unpopularity, at least in November, was probably larger in the South than anywhere else. For example, I know on election day in the state of Tennessee, the president had a 37% favorable rating and about a 63% unfavorable rating. Now, in the state of Massachusetts, he had a 58% favorable rating. So Senator Kennedy benefited from that, and those of us in the South who had the high unfavorable did not benefit. But I think the problem in the South is you're now getting a stacking of constituencies that the Democratic Party is having great difficulty with. One are the alienation of white males, particularly white Southern males. The National Rifle Association, which I think now is primarily identified with the Republican Party, is particularly strong in the South and in the West. There's always been a strong conservative element in the South. It's traditionally been conservative. That's still there, and I think there's still a higher degree of voting based on race there and racist overtones than probably anywhere else in the country. So all of that makes it very difficult for the Democratic Party in the South.
okay, two more quick questions.
Okay, well, I was going to ask about cutting the funding for the congressional caucuses, but I think instead I'm going to follow up on Dave's question. In the aftermath of the elections in '94, there were a lot of discussion groups here about what happened and what happened in particular to the Democratic Party. One of the theories that came up most often that I haven't heard mentioned here tonight was that the Democratic Party did not appeal to its base and did not get out, especially to traditionally Democratic-leaning minority voters in a lot of different areas. So if any of you could take
I think
a
we'll
shot
go
at
to
that,
Mayor
whether that's
Kelly
a
for
problem or
that.
not.
That's, you know.
Well, I think it goes back even to the, if I may say, to the question that was put to Senator Sasser about the alienation among white male voters in the South, which I think is not peculiar to the South. I think it's happening all over America. I think the Democratic Party has always been very schizoid about who it is, and I've been treasurer of that party. As to whether indeed it's going to very boldly stand up and say, I am the party of inclusion, or whether I'm going to be responsive to the sentiment of the moment. And right now in America, and I think everything always comes back to economics, there's a deep disquiet in this country. Because as we look at what's happening down the road, we see that not just government's downsizing, private industry began by downsizing. There may not be enough jobs to go around. And in an environment where there may not be enough jobs to go around, people get nervous about who just might get those jobs.
Right.
Which is why, in fact, you've got affirmative action going on the ballot in California. And what was particularly interesting, when they did these exit polls in November of '94, white men were most upset with women of all color. because we represent quite a number of people in this country. And so the women pose,
Half of them.
and so women pose the greatest threat to those jobs. But there is also the disquiet and impatience with people of color. And for that reason, the politics is, I call it the tribalization of American politics, because people are trying to appeal to that white male voter. And that white male voter says, look, be for me. Just be for me. And let me know that I'm going to have a job and that I'm going to be secure and that I don't have to deal with all these other folks that didn't always exist in the workforce as an equal. And I think that that is what is resonating in all the politics of America in the 90s. And it is an issue with which we've got to come to grips with if America is to live up to her promise.
Last question.
Yeah, my question basically is around keeping people engaged with a message, and I want the gentleman on the end to answer this because I've been a victim of one of y'all's direct mail-ins. I've worked in a lot of Democratic campaigns, and we've, in the last 2 years, got our teeth kicked in by these direct mailings. And it's about message. You've all kept people engaged in the message. My daddy had this saying that either the dog wags the tail or the tail wags the dog, and it depends on how you look at it. So, after talking with Mr. Sasser and some other people, people said that people were just not listening during this campaign. On your end, you've all won, and you're in control. How do you keep people engaged to your message? How do we wake people up? I'd like to
Chris
have
Hennick,
you
you
answer
want-
one part of that.
What the Republican message is now, and how do you stick to it? Is that it?
Well, yeah, essentially.
How
I mean,
it works?
how do you keep people engaged? Because if they start to fall asleep on you, you know, they're going to slide out from under you. They're less apt to slide out under you because your people turn out more. But
And Jill will answer too, because she was a
She-
victim.
she's a victim, sure.
too, yeah.
Sure.
Okay,
It's,
Chris.
in essence, it's 3 words. It's keep your promises. There have been a lot of expectations that were raised in this campaign cycle from Republicans. And I think the next 6 to 8 months, what's going to occur in the states, that's why you're hearing a lot of more driving towards political appreciation toward the 10th Amendment now, and devolution's kind of a catchphrase, buzzword. It's in vogue now politically. But there's got to be a lot of changes made. If it's welfare reform, transferring block grants, 336 programs back to the states, Republicans have to prove themselves rather than run off and chase straw polls, helium balloons, and so forth in Iowa and in New Hampshire. Granted, there's a presidential cycle coming up, but we have a lot of governing to do too. That's why this contract is so important. That's why balanced budget amendment was passed before the State of the Union. The line item veto just yesterday. Republicans are keeping their promise. So that's the first and foremost is our aim, and I expect if the last month and a half has shown how Republicans can keep their promises, we're in for a long breakthrough into a coalition on into the next millennium.
Jill Long.
I think some of that may be the case, but I also think that we need to look back to 1992 when the public was pretty angry at the Republican Party. Even in my congressional district, which is the home of Dan Quayle, and he was on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, George Bush did not do as well as one would have expected. And I think that some of what we're attributing to frustration with the Democratic Party on the part of the voter is frustration in general. And I think 1996 could be a very, very different year than 1994, different in the sense of whom the voters choose to support in terms of wanting change. I think we may still see, even for members that kept their promise and voted the way they said they were going to in the Republicans who were elected in 1994, I think we may see some dramatic change in membership in the House and the Senate in 1996, because I think that the voters are very volatile. They were in 92, they were more so in 94, and depending upon a number of variables, the economy, personal family relationships, a whole host of things, I think we could see a number of Democrats getting elected and Republicans not getting elected in 96.
I'd also just add, I've been on the receiving end of last-minute direct mail pieces. Republicans wanted to cut Social Security, so fortunately the 1994 cycle, that was a dog that didn't bark. So I think the press will cover it.
Well, in the old days,
so much for effective last-minute direct mail pieces.
In the old days in Boston politics, it would be a whispering campaign. You get on the subway and say, oh, isn't it terrible what they said about Morris Tobin? You know, isn't it terrible how sad it is? Well, you've got a lot of great study groups to choose from. I hope you do. Thank you for coming.
All right.